Welcome everyone to another NASCAR Heat Evolution setup video. This video takes us to Kentucky. Now this is a track setup that I have been avoiding for quite a while. Actually, I guess avoiding probably isn't the best term for it because I've run some laps here. I'll work on it a little while with the idea that I'm going to release the setup. Then I'll decide not to because I just don't like the track, can't get comfortable with it. So I'll go away from it, do some other tracks, come back to it, and so on. And the reason is before we even talk about lap times and setup variables and all sorts of stuff like that, I want to talk about the track itself. One, at the beginning of the video, I normally talk about the setup. Then we end the video with me running a lap or two, usually around the track to show you the general line and the speeds that I have. Well, in this case, I'm going to show you a sequence of several laps around the track, some around the AI, some not. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's really what this is all about. And specifically what it's all about is a breakdown of how the track behaves itself. Normally you don't have to worry about that. Some tracks have bumps, some tracks don't, some have more, some have less banking, and so on. But this track is completely different for me than anything else we've done. And the reason for that is turns 1 and 2. Okay, we'll start with turn 3 and 4. Turn 3 and 4 is a normal 1.5 mile track. It's very, with the exception that the track is extremely wide, you can run anywhere from top to bottom and be perfectly fine. So all of that is a non-issue. Turns 1 and 2, however, is a totally different story. Turns 1 and 2, it appears as though what the developers were trying to do with this track is give it progressive banking or variable banking. And what that means is the banking, I'm not sure exactly what the banking is at Kentucky, but let's say that the banking is 12 degrees on the very bottom. Well, they might design the track so you have 12 degrees at the very bottom of the track, and then it goes up to 13 degrees in the middle and maybe 14 degrees at the top. That's the general idea of progressive banking. The banking increases as you get closer to the outside wall. And that's all fine and well and good. It's worked great at Homestead Miami Speedway, which was done several years ago in this fashion. Well, at this track in this game, so I'm not talking about progressive banking in general, I'm talking about progressive banking in this game at this track. It is not done well. And the reason I say that is because the banking transitions are way too sharp. It's almost like they tried to go from, again, I don't remember the exact number of degrees of banking for Kentucky, but it's almost as if they tried to go from 12 degrees to about 16 degrees to about 24 degrees. So you'll find 3 distinct levels of banking that are very noticeable if you happen to cross them while on the track. And the bad part about this is you will cross them on the track if you run a normal line. And a normal line around the track is up against the outside wall on the straightaway and generally diving to the bottom in the corner only to let the car drift out to the wall on corner exit. Well, if you do that at this track going into turn 1 and 2, you're going to get really loose. And part of the reason why I wanted to run several laps for you at the end of this video is to show you, because I do that specifically to show you what will happen. And none of these laps am I charging turn 1, the entry of turn 1, extremely hard. Okay, I've learned my lesson there. I've tried that many times in the past, and there's nothing I can do to the setup that will allow me to charge the corner the way I should be able to charge the corner. So what you're going to see in the videos is just me just taking a normal, basically taking baby steps and going very gentle and tiptoeing into turn 1, and it still gets really loose and I scrub off a lot of speed. So keep that in mind as you're watching the example laps, but it's very noticeable when you cross these. So keep in mind, it's not the setup that's getting you loose. It's not your driving style that's getting you loose. It's the track itself. It's almost as if you were riding around on the apron of the track and then suddenly in the middle of the corner when you're trying to maintain a high level of speed, you suddenly jump up onto the banking of the track. Well, that won't work out too well. And the reason is it's a sudden change in banking. And what it does is it loads up 1 or 2 of the tires more than the others in a very quick fashion. And the car doesn't like that. It upsets the car. And generally, you're either going to spin out or head straight to the outside wall, neither of which is good. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk briefly about lap times, because I didn't even really worry about them all that much. The AI will qualify max difficulty 105% on the pole at around a 30.7, maybe 30.8 second lap. Okay, the setup I'm going to show you can easily run 30.8, and I'm sure much better than that. But again, I got tired of trying to run this thing hard and just tried to simply survive on this track, more or less. So you should have no trouble even if you can't get on the pole in qualifying, you should have no trouble passing these guys during the race. So lap times out of the way, let's talk about the setup itself. As you can imagine, this is the setup that I like the least out of any setup I've done for any track, and that's simply because it doesn't drive the way I want it to. Rather than making this setup to be fast and to get lap time, I had to make it to simply survive turn 1 and 2. And so because of that, I had to compromise quite a bit on speed. Shocks, not done anything with the shocks. 10s across the board there. Let's move on to the weight settings. Max left weight of 54.2 because we're on an oval and we're only turning left. Then you get into the front weight setting, which is much higher than I wanted to make it for this track, at 51.0%. Again, that's just to stabilize the car on entry to turn 1. Wedge at 50.5. Again, higher than I would want, generally because I had tried many different types of setups, different variables on this track. And what I finally determined was I needed to use more wedge than I wanted and more front weight than I wanted in order to keep the car from spinning out in turn 1 when I hit those banking transitions. So that's why those numbers are there. And you'll find that I know a lot of you will comment, and I get messages about how loose the cars are, and which is funny to me because in general, I don't think my setups drive loose at all, but that's just for me. And it's funny to hear some people say they drive extremely loose, and then some people will say they drive tight, so they don't turn well enough. So that's what you get with setups. And this particular setup drives extremely tight for me, so it'd be interesting to see how it works out for you guys. Front and rear weight at the minimum of 4 inches for both. Spring settings, my favorite front spring package is 1,200 pounds, which is the maximum left front spring, 1,000 pound right front spring. Again, that's to help the car turn on corner entry. Yes, I do need the car still to rotate some, even though I'm on the verge of spinning out in turn 1 and 2 sometimes because of the banking transitions. You'll notice if we move to the rear springs that the rear spring split is quite a bit more than I typically use. It's 300 pounds here with the left rear spring of 300 pounds, right rear spring of 600 pounds. And the reason for that is I had to make some of the other variables in this setup so tight to secure the car that I needed something to get me off the corner so that I could actually accelerate off the corner. And the rear spring split helped for that while not hurting the entry too terribly bad and causing me to spin out. The tire settings, only 5 pounds of split there, 25 pounds on the left, 30 pounds on the right. And again, that's to keep the car stable, particularly on the entry of turn 1. Miscellaneous settings, max camber on both the left front and the right front. I did try using quite a bit less camber, and while that can work, for example, I tried using right front camber very close to 0. I think it was -1 or something I was using, and that will work. However, it is extremely slow. And while it was stable, it was much too slow for what I wanted. So I decided to go against that, and I didn't see that big of a difference as far as stability and just going ahead and using the max front camber. So I did that. Front sway bar at my standard 1.5 inches. I can tell you if you still have trouble with spinning the car out on turn 1 because of those banking transitions, then increase this number above 1.5 up closer to 2 inches, and that should help stabilize the car. Again, you're going to lose speed doing that, but it's going to make the car more stable if that's something you need. Rear sway bar, I didn't even want to touch for this particular track because of the stability issues. The track bar, again, the car is extremely tight, so I wanted to continue to increase the track bar, but I found that it hurt the stability too much to be worth it. So I stuck with no split between the two sides and 12 inches on both. Brake bias, you won't really need it unless you want to try some trail braking or something like that going into particularly turn 3. So I stuck with 70%. Again, anywhere from 70 to about 73, 74 seems to work okay for me. Grill tape, not using it. Wheel lock, didn't touch it. Steering offset is the 0.125, which is a number that in general I've sort of settled on as about the maximum I can use for the setups. Because if I go up too much higher than that, I find that the car wants to actually start steering a little bit to the right on the straightaway, and that's something I definitely don't want. I'm fine with the pull to the left. I just try to minimize it a little bit with the steering offset setting. Gear setting is the rear end ratio is at 3.4, which turns quite a few RPM, so feel free to come down off that number. It'd probably help your lap time and also can help the car to rotate some. What I try to do with the gear settings in these videos isn't necessarily give you the optimum gear setting, because that would take a lot of fiddling around that I choose to spend my time working on the rest of the setup. What I try to give you guys an idea of with the rear end ratio is what's the max RPMs you want to turn, what's the max gear you want to put in this thing. So it allows you guys to focus on, if anything, you're going to reduce that 3.4 to something like 3.3 or maybe even 325 or something like that. So that's the setup. Hopefully it works out for you guys. Hopefully it's stable. Again, I've run several laps in this replay for you. And what I tried to do in turn 1 is I'm going to run some laps where I try to cut across those banking transitions and get the car loose so you can see what that looks like and approximately where it is on the track. And I also run some laps where I take the entry to turn 1 and try to shoot into the middle of the track to where I don't hit any of those banking transitions, and you can see sort of where that is on the track as well. So stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat Evolution.
Still there? Still there. You're all clear. Still there.